Nora was used to the weight of small, steady storms. They came in the form of overdue bills, the rasping cough that never quite left her mother's chest, and the hollow, anxious silence of their tiny apartment after the lights went out. On that late, honeyed afternoon, the sky wore the look of some private promise. Warm light sliding across shop windows, a faint, restless wind nudging loose flyers down the sidewalks. Nora tightened the strap of her bag and pedaled faster, not because she enjoyed the speed, but because every second shaved off the commute meant another minute she could spend turning a few extra plates at the diner before catching the bus home. She hadn't noticed the man until she hit him. It was less a collision than a sudden rearrangement. Her bicycle tipped, the world spun, and she tasted dust and copper and a sharp, unexpected fear. A voice, deep, impatient, cut through the stars that had bloomed across her vision. "Watch where you're going." Nora pushed herself up with a grimace, palms smarting against the pavement. The man standing over her was the sort you only ever saw in magazines or in the glass-walled cafes of downtown, suit perfectly cut, shoes that spoke their own language of polish. His hair was artfully messy, and when his eyes met hers, they were startlingly, too startlingly, clear, like winter water. A flash of annoyance lit inside her. There was no time for being stunned. "You could move," she snapped, the anger feeling oddly like armor. "You were standing in the middle of the road." He blinked, as if surprised by the heat in her tone. "You were riding like the world was on fire. Someone could have been hurt." The argument might have ebbed there, a small, forgettable flare. But there was something irrepressibly honest about the way she glared at him, and something equally dissimilar about the way the man studied her. He wasn't offended. He was intrigued. Nora shoved the bike up onto its wheels, heart thudding. The man held out a hand she barely acknowledged, and then, as she turned to leave, he said one thing that made the heat behind her eyes deepen. "You should take better care of that," he said, eyes flicking to the dented pedal. "It's a shame to waste a good bike." "What, like a billionaire wastes things?" She couldn't help the curdled humor that escaped. "How generous of you to lecture me from the center of my commute." He smiled then, small and not entirely kind. "I'm not a billionaire." She left with her cheeks burning, but not because of the indignity or the fall. It was because she'd felt something, call it recognition, call it embarrassment, that she could not name. Later, while she boiled water for tea with practiced fingers, the scrape on her knee throbbed, and her brother's schoolbooks lay open on the tiny table like flags of a fragile future. The apartment smelled faintly of antiseptic and old bread. The radiator clanked and offered no warmth. Nora kept busy with dinner, with homework help, with soothing her mother's cough until the room settled into its habitual, exhausted hush. She should have slept. Instead, she found herself looking out the window at a city that seemed to belong to someone else. Buildings that glinted and diners with soft lighting, people who moved with the ease of not counting minutes or pennies. The man she'd collided with, what did he look like now without the suit? She found the thought absurd, then not absurd at all. It was the kind of thought that made hope dangerous and appetite foolish. 2 days later, Nora stood in front of the glass doors of an upscale restaurant she'd seen only in late-night window gazing. She held her breath and pushed open the door with the deliberateness of someone stepping into a future that might already be written for her. Inside was a world she barely recognized. Linen like river silk, polished silver, servers who appeared to float, and a manager whose stare could cut through fabric. She smelled truffle and citrus and the tidy hum of other people's wealth. "Are you here for the server position?" a woman at the desk asked without looking up from her tablet. "Yes," Nora said, and felt the word like a small, sharp stone in her throat. "Nora Dean, Go down the hall. The manager will see you." The manager's office door was ajar. Nora's knock was like a confession. When she stepped inside and saw who sat behind the desk, something slow and hot rearranged itself in her chest. Marcus Hale. The same man, now with a file in his hands and cool, circling eyes that softened like someone opening a rare book. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise," Marcus said. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the collision and the chafing comments collapsing into an unexpected familiarity. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer disdain. He offered a chair, and when he said, almost casually, "You're hired," Nora took the job with every practical, wounded reason she had. She promised herself she would keep her distance, that this would be just work and wages and nothing else. That night, she dreamed of a different kind of collision, one where hands met and didn't recoil. She woke and pulled on her uniform with the quiet, fierce determination of someone who'd spent a life learning not to rely on anyone. But the world had other plans. Outside the restaurant windows, the city filled with lights and rain clouds gathered like theatrical curtains. Inside, someone named Marcus watched her with an interest that felt like a kind of weather. And for the first time in a long time, Nora wondered what it might be like to let the storm in. Nora's life had been an economy of careful measures. Each day she budgeted not just money, but hope, weighing how much she could afford to want without risking the collapse of everything that mattered. Her mother, Lillian, slept most afternoons, the cough clawing at her chest like a small, relentless animal. Ben, her younger brother, kept to his homework with a concentration that had become their quiet salvation. The gold star on his spelling test was a treasure they framed in laughter for days. The restaurant, Marcel and Cumby, was a place of ritual and soft danger. Nora learned quickly that quality service was a kind of choreography. The exact angle of a napkin, the rhythm of pouring water, the way to smile without giving the customers the thing they paid for. Privilege. She arrived early, not because Marcus watched, but because her pride would not allow sloppy work. Every shift left her feet aching and her back a little more bowed. Still, she took up each task with a diligence that slid beneath Marcus's notice like a current under ice. He noticed everything in the end. Not the luminous surface details, though he noticed those too, but the small choices that made up Nora's life. The way she patched the hem of her uniform in the back, the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear before serving a table with a child, the fact that she always split her break so she could call Lillian and check on her. He began to place little things where she could find them. A fresh cup of coffee on the line when the dinner rush tore through the staff. A wrapped sandwich left on the napkin tray when he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He never made a show of it. He never made her charity. Nora, for her part, was determined to meet kindness with bluntness. She had lived long enough to distrust interventions that carried pity like an emblem. Early on, if Marcus stepped into a crowded dining room and smoothed a customer's complaint with that same composed grace, she bristled. She had no intention of becoming someone saved. It was an exhausting tightrope, accepting help without appearing needy, keeping dignity while needing every dime. One night, near the end of a rush that bent everyone into tiredness, a man at a table sneered at Nora's handwriting on the check. He threw a cutting word, an accusation about competence, and the room contracted. Marcus stepped forward as if a wire had tugged him. His voice was calm but authoritative. He set the man straight without shout or spectacle, and Nora found herself breathing easier. Later, when she slipped into the back to stack unused plates, Marcus was there, silently handing her a towel and a water bottle. "You work too hard," he said. "I don't work hard to be seen," she answered. "And yet you are seen," he said. "By me." Seeing, Nora thought, could be a strange danger. It could further anchor you in someone else's world, or it could offer a gentle bridge. She swung between suspicious caution and a disorienting, warming curiosity. Marcus offered nothing but presence, rare, unobtrusive, oddly steady. He also offered a way to make parts of her life easier, small financial help when the medical bills spiked, a discreet cover for a late bus fare. He did it like a person who'd learned to offer comfort without turning it into drama. Still, life at home was the sternest teacher. Lillian's cough progressed in fits and lulls. Some mornings her voice seemed to fragment into gossamer. Other days she was stubbornly herself, insisting on folding Ben's laundry with a humor that defied the ache. Nora learned to ration evenings between being nurse, sister, breadwinner, and secret holder. Each role demanded a performance where mistakes had direct consequences. One wet evening, exhausted beyond her usual resilience, Nora fainted in the walk-in pantry after the dinner rush. She woke to Marcus's face hovering above her. Light filtered through cooler air. He had carried her, no question, and sat her on a bench with a blanket from the staff room. He fussed like someone whose hands had been trained on fragile things. "You can't do everything," he said. "And who says I have to stop?" she countered, half laughing and half crying. "It's what I know how to do." "You don't have to do it alone," he said simply. The words did not fall like a lecture, but like an offering. Nora's instinct was rebellion, one raised on the idea that dependence equaled weakness. Yet when she found herself telling Marcus the small facts of her life, Lillian's diagnosis, Ben's school award, the rent they couldn't quite pay, he didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. Instead, he listened the way someone listens to a favorite song, head tilting, attention sharp and tender. Over the next weeks, Nora felt the horizon of possibility shift imperceptibly. Marcus's help was not the sort that erased her agency. It left room for her to stand. He paid for a prescription without fanfare. He arranged a consultation with a doctor who expected payment but then bent like a reed at the way he spoke on her behalf. Nora felt both grateful and exposed, like someone stepping into sunlight wearing a thin, fragile coat. In the quiet between shifts, they began to talk. Not the small, transactional conversation of employer and employee, but the sort of slow exchange that let you know the person across the table. Marcus confessed that ambition had once hardened him into a machine. Nora admitted that her dreams had always been practical. A steady job, a safer apartment, a chance for Ben to go to college. She found his laughter unexpectedly easy to be near. He found her stubbornness endlessly, painfully human. Yet their lives moved on parallel tracks, close enough to almost touch and far enough to make everything uncertain. Nora steeled herself against surprises. She had learned that dependency sometimes came wrapped as pity, and pity could burn. So when the first real storm of suspicion arrived, whispered conversations, careless comments in the dark, she braced for impact. The real cost of care, she began to suspect, was not money or time. It was the vulnerability of being seen, truly seen, and the fear that what saw you might not like what it found. For weeks, the rhythm between Nora and Marcus kept to a private tempo. Small kindnesses, quiet acknowledgements, the occasional shared joke. She lived in the spaces between her shifts and home, in the narrow hours where the world felt negotiable. Marcus's attention never swelled to spectacle. It stayed in margins, a steady presence at the edge of her days. She reciprocated with circumspection, a softened tone when he asked about Ben, a quieter laugh that carried no promises. Marcus, for all his public image of affluence and control, had a private life he tended like a carefully curated garden. He loved particulars, books with dog-eared spines, a monochrome photograph of his grandfather in his study, the kind of playlists that mapped moods. But Nora's presence had begun to change him in ways even he couldn't fully name. He found himself less inclined to the aloof distance he'd once wielded as armor. He began to measure his days by whether he'd glimpsed her shadow in the dining room, whether her laugh had threaded through the clatter of plates. On an overcast night that smelled faintly of cut grass and the promise of rain, Marcus invited Nora to stay after her shift to help with inventory. It should have been simple, an exercise in organization. Instead, it felt like the first deliberate act that blurred lines between employer and something else. There was a subtle nervousness that made Nora's fingers clumsier than usual. Marcus leaned beside her at the storage shelves, checking boxes and calling out numbers. "You could rest more often," he said, his voice easy. "I don't want you thinking I can't handle this." Nora said without looking up. Good, he answered. I like when you show me I'm wrong. They both laughed, the sound dissolving into a warmth the room hadn't known. After inventory, Marcus offered to drive Nora home. The streets were empty and glistening, the city's lights reflected in puddles like scattered jewels. She hesitated at the car door, the old rules whispering like a resentful chorus in her ears, but she stepped inside. His car smelled faintly of cedar and lemon. The heater hummed, and the rain began to patter softly against the windows. For a moment, the drive was simply comfortable. Then Marcus reached for her hand, not in a theatrical show of possession, but as if the gesture were a question written in motion. Nora felt the car tilt around them. In the brief silence, with rain muting the world, he brushed his lips to hers with the kind of gentleness that made something deep and sealed loosen. It was not the wild, heedless kiss of a rom-com. It was an intimate, careful thing that rose from a thread of recognition. Nora closed her eyes and let it be what it was. A small surrender. When they broke apart, the world felt rearranged, as if the city itself had tilted a fraction. Say the word, and I'll leave, Marcus murmured, forehead resting against hers. She thought of every time she'd decided to shoulder everything alone. She thought of the nights she'd sat awake counting, and the way Ben's shoulder had felt against her when he slept. She thought of Lillian's voice, brittle and warm. And then beneath the armor she had worn for so long, there was a small, dangerous wish. Don't leave, she said. The days that followed shimmered with possibility, their edges bright and terrifying. They fell into an easy cadence, lunches brief and conspiratorial, small notes left in his office that read like private jokes, hands found under the pass when the kitchen was busiest. Nora's life, which had long been a careful negotiation between need and work, began to contain moments that belonged to her alone. Then, effortless as breath, suspicion crawled in. It arrived at a corner of the dining room where voices softened and watchful eyes paid no attention. Nora was rolling silverware late one night when she noticed that the manager's office door was slightly ajar. A fragment of conversation slipped out. Low, clipped, but clear enough to stab. Marcus's name and someone else's, an easy laughter that held too much ease, spooled into her ears like a thread pulled from a seam. You feel sorry for her, a man said. She's struggling. You're the rich kid looking to play savior. Nora's blood turned to ice. She stood frozen, palms white on the towel, as the words she hadn't known she feared settled into her like a bruise. She heard Marcus's voice, softer, defensive. It's not that. You're the one always there. Be honest. If she weren't down on her luck, would you even notice her? The hush that followed was a low, slow thing. Nora's heart pounded with a dull, heavy anger that started in her stomach and rose into her throat. Her mind filled with images. The coffee he left for her. The plate of warm food he'd brought when she fainted. The way he'd insisted she sit when her knees buckled. Was it all theater? Had she read herself into kindness that had actually been a display? That night, she didn't go home. The next day, she didn't come to work. Her messages went unanswered. Marcus tried to call, failed, and then came to her apartment with that determined patience he'd shown in other things of late. She had been sitting on her couch, knuckles white on the upholstery, when he knocked. When Nora opened the door, she had every line of defense rehearsed. Anger, accusation, the avoidance she had used so many times before. Marcus stepped into the small apartment the way a tide steps into calm water, quietly, inexorably. The scent of his cologne filled the room, and he looked at her like someone who'd been learning to read maps of scars. You heard them, he said. She didn't answer. There was no need. He took both her hands in his and said, Please, let me explain. The explanation held the kind of slow, honest patience of someone who finally recognizes that the map of another life is complicated. Marcus told her about how he'd watched her, not as a spectacle or a problem, but as a person who made him feel less empty. He spoke of the things he admired, how she honored small tasks, how she refused charity, how she loved her family with an unpretentious fierceness. He insisted with a clarity that felt like a hand under her chin that nothing in his actions was performative pity. For the first time since the words had bruised her, Nora let herself hear him. He did not erase the pain. He only handed her a mirror made of words. He saw her, not as an object of benevolence, but as an equal. It was a fragile reconciliation. She wasn't ready to sweep everything away. Trust, she realized, wasn't rebuilt in a single speech, but in the way he stayed, patient, solid, unshowy. The possibility of something truer unfurled like a careful bloom. They stood in the quiet of her apartment, the rain tapped on the window as if the world were listening. The fall had come. Whether they rose together, Nora could not yet say. But the quiet between them hummed with the fragile electricity of someone offering a second chance, and someone, finally, willing to accept it. The days following the confrontation were awkward in the clean, exposed way of places that had been scoured by wind. Nora returned to work because she had to, because Bills did not care for grievances, and because Ben needed supper. Marcus gave her the space she demanded, but did not abandon her to the silence she sought. He adjusted his presence, more respectful distance, more awareness of the emotional topography he'd inadvertently bruised. She watched him in the restaurant in a new light, wary and curious. He continued to pay attention to the small details of service, to the staff's shifting moods, to customers who arrived with their own private dramas. But now, Nora's eyes read him as if from a distance, cataloging, remembering, testing whether what she'd felt before was real or merely a shimmer. Outside work, Nora's life remained stitched tight with responsibilities. Lillian's health had an unpredictable rhythm. Good mornings, bad afternoons, and Nora learned to live in the small victories. An inhaler that helped with a night of coughing, a phone call that lasted without tears. Ben, vigilant and serious beyond his years, clung to school as if it were a lighthouse. Nora worked double shifts and took small, menial extra jobs to keep the accounts from tipping into red. The practical demands of life sharpened her, yet in those rare spare moments she found slivers of wonder she hadn't permitted herself. An unhurried coffee, a walk that didn't end in errands, the hush of rain on the roof. And Marcus kept coming up against the walls she set. At times she felt like a fortress. At others, a room with doors she'd closed long ago. He never pushed too hard. He never forced apologies that felt like performance. Instead, he moved with a patience that felt like an offering. He hired Nora's favorite doctor for a consult and paid discreetly for charges that would otherwise have toppled them. He met Ben at the park with the kind of unassuming attentiveness that made the boy giggle. He noticed the smallest things, her preference for tea over coffee, the way she frowned when thinking, and honored them. But trust is not built on good deeds alone. It had to be earned conversation by conversation, day by day. Nora's suspicion was not merely about money or charity. It was a scar from years of being evaluated by handouts, of being measured against someone else's standards. When Marcus offered help, her instinct was to test it. Was it to soothe his guilt? Was it a performance for the public? The man had resources and power, and perhaps the capacity to misread his own impulses as benevolence. There was one evening, a small spare hour, that became a quiet test. Nora had been called to the hospital. Lillian needed a new prescription and a scan that would take time and funds. Nora left in a flurry, worry tightening her jaw. Marcus, hearing the news, stepped forward without flamboyance. He called in a favor to a specialist, arranged the appointment, and waited in the lobby with a paperback until the scan was done. When Lillian emerged, pale and shaking, Marcus handed Nora an envelope without fanfare. Inside were the bills already covered and a note. No explanations. Call me if you need anything. Nora looked at him and for the first time felt the question of motive fall away from the body of the gesture and rest simply on its presence. Yet a bigger reckoning loomed, one that was not about money, but about autonomy. On a Tuesday morning, while clearing plates, Nora overheard a conversation she hadn't meant to catch. Marcus and his friend Ryan, a man who moved through social circles with a practiced swagger, speaking in a voice that dripped with casual opulence. "You like to play savior, Marcus," Ryan said, a smirk in his words. "She's so ripe for it. Dark apartment, sick family. You and your messianic complexes." Marcus's response was guarded at first, then rawer than she expected. "She isn't a charity case." Ryan laughed softly, an emotionless sound. "You have to admit it's convenient. You fix things. She looks grateful. It's also picturesque." The words reopened what Nora feared most, that she was being used as a prop in someone else's story. She retreated into herself, a shell of practiced defenses. Marcos noticed immediately. His calls became quieter, more insistent, and then more respectful of silence. But he did not give up. Instead, he made himself accountable in ways that were awkward and honest. He introduced them to his sister, to his closest friends. He answered questions about his motives with more vulnerability than she could have expected. He told her how his youth had been marked by a hollow compartmentalization, powerful at work, emotionally distant at home. Nora's presence had exposed something tender he'd long kept locked. He wanted to be with her, he said, not to own her or fix her, but to walk beside her. There were no grand declarations. There were late-night talks, small reconciliations, and a steady insistence that he saw her for all her complexities and scars. Nora's guard slowly opened, not because his gestures were grander, but because they were consistent. She tested him with a simple ask. "Don't speak for her in public." If she had to explain herself, let her do it. He agreed, without words that argued, and for the first time the armor she'd carried began to loosen around her shoulders. Trust, she realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the slow practice of seeing someone else and deciding to stay. As autumn's light thinned and the city grew colder, there came a quiet peace. It was not the dramatic, cinematic kind of peace. It was not the sudden flattening of problems. Instead, it was the soft, patient work of being present for another person's life, of taking the smallest of actions that mean everything. Marcus and Nora learned, in halting steps and clumsy talk, how to keep a life together, not by grand gestures, but by shared responsibility, by the humility to ask and the grace to receive, by the courage to trust in the presence of one who didn't seek to own, but to stand beside. Relationships, like old houses, reveal their weaknesses when you least expect them. For Nora and Marcos, the test arrived not as a dramatic showdown, but in the slow erosion of a promise. The promise that whatever they had would not be shaped by public spectacle or pity or the casual judgments that dry up trust. Everything shifted when a local lifestyle blogger published a breathless piece about the restaurant and its mysterious philanthropist owner who rescues staff in need. The article painted Marcus as a modern-day benefactor, handsome, generous, and likable in the way that made headlines. Photographs, stolen or staged, Nora never knew, showed him laughing with staff, handing over a fake check in a publicity shot. Nora felt the floor drop again. The piece depicted her, unintentionally, as the completed version of a savior story. The silent, grateful recipient, she and Marcus argued, not with the fevered drama of unchecked accusations, but with the raw, brittle honesty of two people who had weathered too much to trivialize pain. "I didn't ask for this," Nora said. "I've been careful not to be anyone's charity." "I know," Marcus replied, "and I tried to stop it. My PR people are idiots sometimes. They wanted a story, and they got one. But I didn't put your face in the paper. Whether you did or not, I'm the one who looks like a charity case," she said. "People will look at me differently now. They'll pity me, And pity is another chain. He reached for her hand across a table, the gesture earnest and humble. I'm sorry. I should have fought harder. I should have made sure our privacy was respected. The apology mattered, but so did the structural damage. The world was quick to assign roles, and once the narrative took root, it was hard to uproot. Nora found patrons looking at her with a strange softness, as if she were a melancholy accessory to someone else's good deed. Some co-workers watched with the flickers of envy. Others avoided her, as if the story had placed her beyond reproach. But Marcus did not retreat. He walked the smaller, slower path. He demanded that any future coverage be collaborative. He insisted the staff be allowed to tell their own stories, on their own terms. He went to his PR team and set a boundary. No more photos of the staff without consent, and no more one-dimensional narratives. He also accepted that what he had failed to control had consequences, and he learned to let the privacy of Nora's life be her own. Nora, for her part, fought on a more personal front. She met the pitying stares with a quiet dignity that made her feel like iron. But pity is not easily vanquished. Sometimes it crept into Ben's conversations at school, comments that made him flush and avoid friends, and sometimes it seeped into the diner's smallest corners. Yet there were unexpected allies. Co-workers who had seen Marcus's quiet, consistent behavior stood up for her. They spoke of her competence, of the way she meticulously set tables, and of her kindness on hard nights. Their private life, meanwhile, deepened into something less fragile. They learned to carve out rituals. Friday walks by the river where they talked about nothing and everything. Late-night dinners made from whatever pantry items they could find. Quiet mornings when Marcus would make tea and Ben would clamber into their lap. Those small acts stitched together a life that felt both ordinary and profound. They each learned, painfully and slowly, to give and receive help without merging into dependency. Then came the hardest reckoning, a medical result that forced a choice. Lillian's scans suggested a treatment that was costly and experimental, hope wrapped in financial peril. Nora looked at the numbers the way one confronts a storm. Inevitable, terrifying. Marcus offered to write a check that would cover everything, no conditions attached. It was the kind of offer that could end the immediate problem, but it also threatened to widen the gap between them again. Nora declined at first. Not because she wanted the burden, but because she wanted the dignity of being in the decision with him, not under it. Marcus understood. He suggested a different plan. Together they would find a way. He would cover part of it, but not all. She would crowdsource what she could, apply for grants, and lean on the community. They negotiated finances like a couple of architects designing a house. What could be paid now? What had to be borrowed? What loans were acceptable? Marcus sat beside Nora as she called clinics, filled forms, and learned the language of medical finance. They were, in a way, building something together, not just the treatment fund, but a new grammar for their relationship. It was during those long, tiring weeks, forms and consultations and nights awake worrying, that Nora realized the truth of Marcus's earlier words. He wasn't trying to save her the way one might rescue a drowning creature. He was trying to swim with her. When the treatment began, neither of them felt triumphant nor naive. They felt steady and human. In the empty spaces between hospital machines and silent waits, they talked about the future. Not as a faraway dream, but as practical plans, repairing the apartment, saving for Ben's college fund, scheduling vacations that might stay small but would be theirs. They learned to live with uncertainty and to find meaning in small, resilient decisions. Through the test of public perception and the pressure of real-world crisis, their bond survived because it had shifted from being about pity to being about partnership. That's the kind of love that doesn't erase inequity. It acknowledges it and chooses to act in ways that respect both autonomy and mutual care. Nora and Marcus emerged from the strain not as perfect lovers, but as people who had learned how to keep a life together without erasing each other's agency. Spring returned like an apology, gentle, unexpected, and green. The city softened, and with it came an ordinary kind of hope that was not loud, but persistent. Lillian's treatment, while difficult, had shown results that lifted a weight from Nora's chest. Ben collected another gold star and an invitation to participate in the school play. Bills still demanded attention, and everyday life remained a craft of compromise and tenacity. But a new rhythm had settled over Nora's household, one that included laughter more often than it used to. Nora and Marcus moved forward with a sense of careful optimism. Their relationship had weathered suspicion, public misrepresentation, and the harsh glare of financial strain. Those pressures, rather than scarring them into distance, had taught them how to hold each other without taking away each other's power. They shared chores and bills and quiet mornings. They also kept separate spaces. Nora insisted on a small shelf in Marcus's study where her books lived. He insisted on learning how to make Ben's favorite scrambled eggs. It was, in small ways, an enactment of equality. On weekend mornings they visited the farmer's market, wandering among stalls that smelled of fresh bread and cut herbs. Nora loved the way Marcus learned the names of the vendors and nodded seriously at choices. She loved the way he let Ben pick out an extra pastry on Saturday, a small ritual that filled the boy with light. In those moments, they were ordinary, uncomplicated people sharing mundane joys, proof that a life built of many small acts can feel rich. Work at the restaurant remained demanding, but Nora found herself less exhausted by the end of the day. She had Ben's laughter to return to and Marcus's steady presence. Sometimes customers recognized her from the old article and offered awkward apologies. Nora accepted them with a smile that had a new, patient strength. Co-workers who had once watched from the sidelines now supported her openly. Trust, it turned out, is contagious. When a staff member faced eviction, Nora, backed by Marcus's influence and their shared network, helped organize a fund that kept the colleague afloat without spectacle. There was still fragility in their lives, the kind that did not vanish with love. Money remained an ongoing calculation. Lillian's health required vigilance. But where once fear had dictated decisions, they now made choices together, with humor and compromise. They began to dream in practical increments, saving for a modest move into a slightly larger apartment, setting aside a small fund for Ben's college extracurriculars, planning a short trip as a family that would not require loans. One evening, months after the storm of headlines, Marcus asked Nora to walk with him to the river. The city glittered and the air smelled like baked bread and the promise of rain. They walked in silence for a while, hands swinging loose. Then Marcus stopped, took both her hands, and looked at her as if he were memorizing the lines of a poem. "Nora," he said, voice steady, "I don't want to pretend I have all the answers. I don't. But I want to keep showing up. I want to build a life with you, not to rescue you, but to stand with you. Will you let me?" Nora thought of every quiet kindness and every bruise. She thought of Ben's laugh and Lillian's tired, grateful smile. She thought of the many times she'd had to stand up for herself and of the moments Marcus had quietly stood by her, never insisting, always present. She realized then that love, in its best form, was not a vanishing of need, but a meeting of wills, one that honored agency and offered partnership. "Yes," she said finally, "but on one condition. No more stories about saviors. We tell our own story." He laughed, the sound a little wet with relief. Agreed. They walked on, toward apartments and dinner and the small, ordinary tasks that made up a life. It was not a fairy tale. There were no sweeping miracles and no instantaneous cures. Their victory was quieter. A shared grocery list, a future being sketched in careful, practical lines, a family learning to be a family in the same space as the city outside. In the years that followed, they continued to face the long, attentive work of living. They argued sometimes, about money, about parenting, about pride, and reconciled with what had become an artful patience. Ben grew into a confident teen, supported by a neighborhood that had come to respect Nora for her resilience and warmth. Lillian found more good days than bad, and the house filled with an easy calm that had once been rare. When Nora looked back at the night of the bicycle crash, the moment that started a chain of unknowable consequences, she did not feel regret. It had been a messy, beautiful opening into a life that required more than survival. It required trust, honesty, and the courage to accept help without losing oneself. Marcus had not saved her. Together they had learned to shoulder life's burdens. Their story was not about wealth or pity. It was about two imperfect people who chose to stand side by side. A quiet, stubborn love that learned how to listen, how to repair, and how to build new ground, one small, steady step at a time.